There are old descriptions of Christian cities that do not sound poor, dim, or broken. They sound radiant. Not metaphorically radiant, not just spiritually radiant. Radiant in a way that almost sounds physical. Old texts speak of churches shining like the sun, saints ruling beside kings, festivals so beautiful they felt almost heavenly. So the question is not whether the language is dramatic. The question is, what kind of world produces descriptions like this? We are usually told to picture the so-called Dark Ages as cold, crude, and half-forgotten. A world of hardship, superstition, and dim interiors. But some of the old chronicles and hagiographies do not feel like they are describing a dim world at all. They feel like they are describing a luminous civilization. Not perfect, not sterile, but filled with splendor, ceremony, radiance, and a kind of public sacredness that official history tends to flatten into symbolism. One old line says the churches shone like the sun. Another describes the land as filled with churches, with the people living in peace and great piety, and the feasts being kept as though heaven itself had leaned close to earth. There are accounts of rulers keeping company with saints as counselors. Accounts of worship that sounds less like private belief and more like participation in a transformed order. Now maybe all of this is simply poetic exaggeration. That is possible. But even then, the poetry itself still matters. Because poetry reveals expectation. It tells you what a civilization thinks glory looks like. The deeper suspicion. And this is where the question starts to grow teeth. What if some of these descriptions were not only devotional language? What if they were preserving memory of a world in which sacred architecture did more than house ritual? What if the cathedrals were not merely beautiful buildings, but part of a lived environment that felt charged, ordered, resonant, almost alive? There are researchers who look at old churches, bells, domes, geometry, acoustics, and impossible scale, and wonder whether beauty and function used to be less divided than they are now. Whether the sacred and the practical may once have overlapped in ways we no longer recognize. And then the art starts whispering too. Golden domes, vast interiors, impossible light. Crowds gathered under structures that seem built not merely to contain people, but to transform atmosphere. Even when the paintings are symbolic, they may still be carrying memory. Not memory in the modern documentary sense, memory in the older sense. The sense in which an image tells you what the world felt like when it was still aligned with itself. Why this matters? If the old world was more radiant than we are told, then the loss is larger too. Because then the story is not just that technology improved and faith faded. The story might be that something luminous was broken apart, relabeled, and made easier to dismiss. And once that happens, even wonder gets archived as myth. So I am not asking you to force a conclusion, only to notice the pattern. Notice how often old texts reach for light. Notice how often sanctity sounds architectural. Notice how often the past is described as though heaven once touched earth more closely than we imagine. Maybe it was all metaphor. But maybe metaphor is sometimes the last surviving shell around memory. And if that is true, then some of the old churches were not only houses of worship, they were witnesses.